Welcome to Thought to Action, brought to you by the Herb London Centre for Policy Research. I'm Tim Wilson, a Senior Fellow at the Centre. Please share this video and others in our Thought to Action series with your friends. And if you like what we do, subscribe to the channel. You can also find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Getter, Rumble, and various other social media sites. And also, if you like what we do, help us out by going to patreon.com/thoughttoaction. If you like what we do, you can get previews and non-public clips by following us on that channel and subscribing to help us just a little bit to do what we do. With me today is my very good friend, retired Navy Captain Pete O'Brien, who is a distinguished fellow at the London Centre. And today we're going to talk a bit about the Second Amendment, an important topic for us all, and there's a lot going on. This is going to be a big year for the Second Amendment. It's been a big year over the last couple of years as well in all sorts of ways. Before I get into the specifics, however, Pete, do you have anything in particular you want to raise about the topic?
I would like to start off by just bringing up something that just happened. We have a new mayor in town in New York City. Not that I live there, but everybody follows New York City, don't they? And there's also, of course, the district attorney for the city, and they are at odds. The new mayor is pro law and order. He's a former policeman, retired policeman, and he wants to bring the spike in crime, and particularly in violent crime in New York under control. Wants to drag that down. The district attorney, meanwhile, has announced all sorts of new rules about who will and will not be prosecuted. And basically, there is a drift from the district attorney's office to letting a whole bunch of folks go without prosecution. And I think that's an interesting backdrop when you look at the fact that New York City has some of the most difficult rules to hurdle if you want to have a firearm to protect yourself. So I'll just throw that out there for everybody to germinate in the back of their heads here as we continue this discussion.
That makes a nice link, actually. Just at the moment, Peter and I are doing some research on a variety of topics, and Chicago tops the list for murders in the country with 774 in 2020, but it's closely followed by Philadelphia and New York City. New York City with 462 murders in 2020. That is horrendous, and a huge increase even from the year before when it was 318. And what is clear from the data that we gather is that armed citizens are one of the best defenses against violent crime, and I'll do a bit more on that in a minute. But I would just say, as Pete rightly pointed out, the district attorney, one of the crimes, for example, that he's banned or has said that he will not charge anymore is resisting arrest. Can you imagine being a cop in an already disheartened New York City Police Department, and you're suddenly told that resisting arrest is no longer a crime? Talk about open season for the criminals to give cops a really hard time physically.
And it's important to take a look at our history, the history of some of these big cities. New York City has been through this before. New York City, of course, I want to say in the early 80s, peaked at, I think they had one year, they had over 2,000 murders.
Yep.
And if you look at the decade or so prior to that in New York City, they had gone through a series of very liberal mayors and very liberal district attorneys, and they had come up with a whole host of rules. They weren't laws, they were rules, just passed, decided on by the government of the city itself, that restricted the behavior, if you will, the tactics of the police. Things that now came to be called stop and frisk, the movement of policemen out of their cars, if you will, and onto the sidewalk, get the police patrolling on foot, getting them to know the local folks, and the lawyers would say, and harassing the local folks, but really they were working with the local shops, and also they were noticing if there were a couple of clowns on the corner, guys like Tim and I when we were 19. You know, they would you know, question you. They would you know, make sure that you knew that they were there. Well, all these various tactics that they developed over time were really all brought together under and I just dropped the commissioner of police's name, but then Rudy Giuliani, sorry, came in as the mayor, and they really tightened the whole thing down. Both Giuliani as district attorney and Giuliani as the mayor, and over a period of perhaps a dozen years, they turned all of this right around to the point where New York City became quite safe for a large city.
Yep.
And now we see over particularly the last 4 years, they have turned all of it on its head, and all those advances, all the progress that was made in the late 80s and through the 90s and into this century are all being unwound. And at the same time, and this is why I was getting someplace, at the same time, they have come up with new rules that are going to make it harder for the average citizen to own a firearm, to include a truly outrageous requirement for a very expensive liability insurance, which will make it virtually impossible for lower middle income folks to afford a firearm legally.
Yeah, the insurance one is very interesting because New York State is one of those that has led the way in requiring armed individuals to have insurance, but it bans most firearms type insurance, especially third-party cover, which is what you need if you're going to protect innocent victims, as it were. And they've banned legal cover as well, which is particularly important if you're a law-abiding citizen who ends up being forced to use a firearm. It's fascinating that the reason that Pete and I were looking at the crime statistics across the number of murders in various cities around the country is because actually America is a very peaceful place. And as firearms sales and firearms ownership have exploded over the last 10 years, and with records being set for the last couple of years in particular, basically since the outbreak of the pandemic and the various riots that have gone on, we are seeing firearms ownership exploding. And what we do not see is a vast dramatic increase in gun crime. Yes, we're seeing more murders in the big cities. Those are the places where the gun control people have made it next to impossible to own a gun legally. So it's the criminals that are armed. It's not the ordinary citizen. And there's a couple of issues that I must just comment on quickly there. One is to keep a very close eye on the Supreme Court, where this year, we will be seeing a decision in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, which is specifically about the way that New York City makes it almost impossible for an ordinary private citizen to get a permit to own a gun. Right, and New York City is one of the few places where long guns and shotguns are included in the permitting process and the ban on owning them and keeping them around in New York City itself. Crime has rocketed in those places. Crime in the rest of the country, however, has dropped steadily at the same time as, and it's a correlation which isn't necessarily cause and effect, but it's a definite correlation. As gun ownership increases, crime, violent crime in particular, drops. And another topic that Pete and I wrote about, and we have it up on our website at londoncenter.org, is the way that the FBI has now released data, which is fascinating in its implications. In particular, they've shown that justifiable homicides by civilians for the first time ever have overtaken justifiable homicides by law enforcement. And significantly, there were 343 justifiable homicides by civilians as compared to 298 by law enforcement. The implications of that are huge. Pete, would you like to run with that a bit?
I would, and I'll take an angle from this that one that's often used by those who are opposed to private firearm ownership, in comparing U.S. Crime statistics to other countries. It is routine, of course, to say that the murder rates in Europe are lower than in the United States. It is not, however, ever raised that the violent crime rates throughout much of Europe are higher than in the United States. But if you then go further afield, if you look at much of the rest of the world, there are some interesting statistics. One of them is that the level of firearm ownership in much of the rest of the world is very low. And while you may think that that these firearm ownership statistics in much of the rest of the world in some way correlate to levels of violence, they don't. The remarkable statistics are in places like Somalia or Afghanistan, in Mali, in Cameroon, in the Congo in particular, very low to very low levels of firearm ownership. Somalia has, I believe, less than 1/2 the number of firearms per head as does the United States. The Congo has something less than 10% of the number of firearms per head in the United States. Of course, the Congo is arguably the most violent spot on the planet and has been for 25 or 30 years. It is atrociously violent. And there's an interesting correlation here, is that if you look at a number of weapons in the hands of private individuals, and then you look at in given towns, and then you look at the amount of violence being perpetrated on those towns by a whole host of gangs and rebel groups, etc., what you find is the people in these towns are utterly unarmed. And it raises an interesting issue is if these people had private ownership, would the violence be anywhere near as high as it is? And I've been looking for some sort of tag here, and I reduced it to this interesting question, which of course we can't answer, but it is an interesting question to mull over. If the Jewish communities in Europe had all been armed in the 1930s and into the 1940s and had not surrendered their arms or never had arms, would the same horrors have happened? They might have, but they might not have. And I think it's an interesting question to ask: is how did the disarming of the population over decades, over actually centuries, in Europe facilitate the horrors that were perpetrated on those same populations by the Nazi regime, the fascist regimes during World War II?
It also, just to loop it back round again, it gets really interesting that the 7 worst cities in America for murders are the ones with very strict gun control.
Exactly.
And one has to ask what the crime rates would be if that was reversed. And we have seen states getting rid of or relaxing gun control. And despite the dire predictions of those in favor of gun control, we have not seen mass murder and mayhem, gunfights on the streets. It hasn't happened. What we see is that these areas with the strict gun control are the centers of murder. And stepping back again as well to this business about justifiable homicides, that actually says, it's been a truism amongst the gun community for a long time that when seconds count, the police are only minutes away. The very fact that we now have more justifiable homicides being committed by civilians suggests that has become the case, that it is now more common for citizens to defend themselves, their family, and their community than it is waiting for law enforcement to arrive to deal with an armed situation. And to knock back on, so Pete, you can comment again, there is also the interesting implication that as we see this huge rise in gun ownership and we see the drops in violent crime, you have to ask, what would be the effects on minority communities and, for example, the rape statistic and how that might be affected if guns were more easily permitted to law-abiding citizens in the places that are the center of these problems.
And absolutely, we need to, as a society, run down that road here. There's 135,000 rapes in the United States each year reported. Arguably, there are substantially more. I would simply respond by saying every woman over the age of 17 ought to have a pistol in her pocketbook. That would certainly do something to the rate of rapes. The interesting statistic here, John Lott has pulled all the statistics apart again and again and again, and he came up with a number that suggested, this is a couple of years old now, is that for every 1% increase in a population, 1% increase in firearm ownership, there is a corresponding 1% decrease in violent crime.
Yep.
And what is more violent a crime than rape? And I would suggest that for a lower to middle income woman living on her own in an inner city, the inability to defend herself is criminal. We should give her the ability to defend herself. And it is clear, talking to criminals, you talk to criminals and you ask them, there have been multiple of these interviews online. If you ask them, how do you pick out a house? How do you pick out some place to break into, some place to rob? How do you pick up people who you're going to rob? And they'll all come back to very obvious issues that if they suggest that the individual is or might be armed, they stay away from that individual. The old saw is they'll never go into a house that has an American flag flying because they figure the guy has a gun. That may or may not be good logic, but it does indicate something. The point being is they think if the guy has a gun, they're not going to go in there. Now, if you thought you're a criminal, you're a bad guy, you want to mug somebody, steal their wallet, you want to kill somebody, you want to rape somebody, and you think that the folks in front of you, everybody in the street in front of you has a gun, what are you going to do? You're going to go to another street. And that idea of the firearm working to defend the average citizen is something that we somehow seem to have lost track of. And yet, to go back to your point, Tim, again, I believe we've mentioned this before, New York City is well known and well regarded because they have a less than 5-minute response time for the average 911 call, which is spectacular. It's brilliant. Unfortunately, the average violent crime takes something like 3 minutes, and that gives 2 minutes or 1 minute plus for the bad guy to get away. The idea that somehow the police are going to save you is probably wishful thinking at best. In most cases, there simply aren't enough police around to do it.
Absolutely right.
So it's up to you.
Yep. And let me just say, I'll wrap this up by saying, we've tried gun control. We've had the experiment for a while during the 70s and 80s. It was spreading and it was more and more serious in local districts and in states. We've tried at the state level relaxing those gun controls, and it has paid off. One has to ask when the gun control people are going to at least consider the idea of letting some of the big cities relax it and see what happens to the crime rates there. We have data coming in. It's useful in that it informs us in how our policies should operate. And it seems as though the link between more guns and less crime is strong enough that by not relaxing gun controls, we are actually increasing the number of violent crimes, in particular murder and rape. unnecessarily around the country. It comes down once again to faith in the US citizen. I am a huge proponent of the belief that the law-abiding citizen can be trusted with guns. It is the criminals that are the problem. And how can a law-abiding citizen defend themselves against a criminal with a gun other than by having a gun? The left does not seem to have an answer for that. It's a risky policy in some ways, I understand that. But at some stage, some of the big cities are going to have to try it. As you say, arming the women in the ghettos, if you like, in the barrios, in the poor people are the ones that really need it. The minorities are ones that really need it. And the weak are the ones that need it, because a gun is a great equalizer as a tool. It makes you equal, even if you weigh 100 pounds wet, it makes you the equal of the 300-pound thug coming to rob you or rape you. Right. Pete O'Brien, thank you very much indeed. This has been Thought to Action by the London Centre for Policy Research. You can find more about what we do at londoncentre.org. Please follow us. Please subscribe to this video channel. And if you like what we do, follow us and like and subscribe to our patreon.com/Thought to Action channel. And we're on all of the social media as @the LCPR. Thank you very much for watching.